Welcome. I'm Margaret Flowers,
And I'm Kevin Zeese.
and welcome to the second class of the Popular Resistance School on how social transformation occurs.
And today we're going to talk about the central issue. How do people power movements build power?
That's right.
The goals of this lecture, after this lecture, you're going to be able to talk about and understand the characteristics of successful social movements, what works and what doesn't. And you'll be able to understand grand strategy, why that's important, and how that relates to the pillars of power,
Right.
which really hold the system in place.
We'll also go into some mechanisms of change, and we'll touch on how nonviolence and violence impact the success of a social movement.
So this class is going to try to take the best information we found on all of the research on social movements, and there's a lot of research, so people really know what works and what doesn't from past experience.
That's right. First, we're going to draw from a book by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan. It's called How Civil Resistance Works. And they looked at 100 years of history of social movements and analyzed it to determine which factors led to more likely success of those movements. And to start off talking a little bit about a political theory, there were some who put forth the idea that it's political opportunities arise, and that's when social movements can succeed. Others focus more on what the actual social movement does in terms of its resources and organization. But Chenoweth and Stefan say that it's really both of those things. It's really an interaction between the political opportunities that arise and how well the political movement or social movement is organized and what resources it has to take advantage of that opportunity.
And that's why we really have been writing that the 2020s are going to be a decade of transformation, because both the political opportunities and the movement are coalescing at the same time to a very transformative decade.
Potential for a very transformative decade.
Yes, we have to do the work to get there.
Exactly.
And that's what we're doing in this class.
That's
one reason why.
Part of it, that's
Yeah.
right. There is consensus, though, among people who study social movements that power depends on the consent of the civilian population, and that when that population, takes its support away from one system and gives it to another system, or takes that support away from one person, gives it to another person, that's when you have political transformation that occurs.
The people have the power to stop the system from working.
That's right.
If they use that power, they can create transformative change.
That's right. So the power system or the power holders need certain things in order to actually have their power. One of those things is authority. The public needs to believe that they are the authority and it must be obedient to them.
And they need human resources. They need people to make things happen. They need the security state to enforce their power.
Right.
Show their legitimacy.
And they need people who have skills and knowledge to do those things that are required to have the system running.
And there are lots of intangible factors that can change the political dynamic, the power dynamic, the role of religion, the role of political culture, unpredictable things that also are a requirement of they have to control in order to have power.
That's right. They also need material resources. If the power holders control things like access to water, access to land, access to energy, then they are able to use that to control the population.
And the ability to enforce their power with sanctions, whether it's law enforcement, prosecution, imprisonment, or whether it's economic sanctions, taking away certain services like healthcare services, taking away the post office, taking away whatever services people need. They have the people in power have the power to remove that and issue sanctions. That gives them that's one of the requirements of power.
That raises a really interesting point, because in the United States, although we don't often talk about this, people in the United States are effectively being sanctioned in terms of that we don't have access to health care when we need it. Not every person has the health care that they need. Access to education is declining. Affordable housing is declining. Wages have been stagnant for a long time. So people in the United States are actually feeling these sanctions right now that keep many people from being able to have the power that they need to, do political activity.
And a lot of those powers are changes in policy that are almost economic sanctions against the people.
Right.
I mean, look at college. I mean, how college tuition has risen so quickly, how debt of youth has risen so quickly. It
Right.
didn't used to be that way.
Right.
That's an economic sanction against a whole generation of youth.
Yeah, you and I didn't come from wealthy families,
No,
but you were able to go to law school, and I was able to go to medical school, and
and we
uh,
had some debt, but
there was an outrageous
not
debt.
like stranglehold debt.
And you could literally, work and be able to pay your tuition. Students right now, there's no way that they can work and cover the tuition for the, schools.
And in fact, the whole safety net has really been weakened. You could say shredded by this idea of power, holding that money up, sanctioning the people economically, so more power can go to their favorite things: tax cuts for the wealthy, tax
Right.
cuts for corporations, corporate welfare for corporations,
Right.
military spending. That's what the power holders want to spend money on, and so they sanction the people in order to put the money in those places.
And enrich all their buddies.
So there are certain characteristics of successful social movements when you look at them over a period of time. Looking at more than 100 years of what movements have worked and what haven't, the most important ingredient is building a mass movement,
Right.
a movement that represents a large percentage of the population in multiple ways. Fringe movements lose, mass movements win. And so the first goal and the constant goal is keep on building that movement, make it bigger and bigger, make it more and more powerful.
Right. What some people sometimes call a movement of movements. Diversity is also very important because diversity shows that you have broader public support. Diversity also brings a diversity of ideas, and so you have greater creativity.
And we'll talk a little bit more about the importance of creativity and resilience and how diversity helps that as we get into this.
Right.
The other thing that's really critically important is national consensus. This is the key ingredient. It's really where the movement is right now, as we'll talk about in the future. But national consensus means people agree that something needs to be changed. And so if you have a mass movement that represents national consensus, you are on the verge of victory.
Right. And then you need to activate 3.5% of the population. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. And resilience is also very important.
One of the most important things about developing a mass movement is getting people to participate, get them to come out and be part of the movement.
It's very hard to have a mass movement if people can't participate in it.
Exactly right.
So Chenoweth and Stefan wrote about a number of factors that could serve as potential barriers to people participating in a movement. One of those is physical barriers. Are they physically able to do what's necessary in order to carry out the goals of that movement? So if you're talking about that the only way you're going to win is by, blockading everything, some people can't physically, engage in blockades or direct action.
The big one is informational barriers, and that's really true in the United States, where we have a very controlled corporate mass media
Right.
that controls the information we see, all sorts of propaganda that we're given about also very wide variety of issues. We're starting to break that down with social media and independent media, but informational barriers are a big issue in the United States.
That's right. And then moral barriers. Does the movement conflict with the moral beliefs of people, or is it consistent with them so that they feel comfortable participating?
And commitment. Are people able to commit to this effort?
Right.
People are struggling economically. People aren't given the information they need. And so that makes commitment more difficult. But getting people to commit to this, that's one of the jobs of the movement, is
Right.
to create a situation where people can make that kind of commitment and want to make that kind of commitment.
Well, and that they're able to make that type of commitment and still do what they need in order to,
Survive.
exactly. Right. And then diversity is really important, as we mentioned before, but diversity in this respect means that if people feel comfortable being part of that movement, they see other people there that are, similar to them, and they feel welcome within that movement. It's really key.
And I think one of the things about participation is the actions of the movement can either invite participation or push participation away.
Right.
And I think one of the issues that we have to deal with when we talk about that is the issue of violence versus nonviolence.
That's right. If you think about it, if a movement is a violent movement, say it's an armed movement or some sort of guerrilla type of warfare movement, then that puts in place all sorts of potential barriers. Physical barriers are imposed because some people might not be physically fit to participate in that way, or to do the training to participate in that way, or to be able to, engage in that kind of a warfare.
Or want to, maybe against a kind of a morality issue for people to participate in a violent. And that's one reason why
That's right. Violent movements sometimes succeed in certain cases. What's also interesting about that is that when violent movements are violent, they're less likely to have a long-lasting effect or to result in a more democratic form of, government afterwards. But I think about a history that many people don't know about in the United States, and that was that there was, in the decade before the American Revolution, there was a very strong nonviolent movement in the United States where people were withdrawing their support.
It's kind of interesting when you look back at that, before you get to the whole story. It's almost like all the Gandhian and Martin Luther King tactics were used by colonists against England for the 10 years before the revolution actually happened.
These are kind of common
Some people
sense.
say that the revolution actually won before the war began.
Right, because people were withdrawing their support. They were making their own products, so they weren't buying them from England. There was mass participation. Women were very strong in that because women were often part of the manufacturing of food and clothing and necessities that people needed. And some say that it was really when the revolution turned to an armed revolution that participation really dropped off. Women could no longer really participate in that way. And it kind of allowed instead of a democracy, it allowed those with the most resources to come in and set up a form of government that was fairly anti-democratic.
In the pre-war period, you saw things like general assemblies at the local level, where they changed leadership constantly. Very democratic, direct democracy kind of activities that they would do. You saw colonists go into courtrooms where there were British judges and walk the judges out of the courthouse and take over the courtroom themselves, become their own judicial system. So these kinds of activities were happening. And you mentioned that started to produce our own goods, especially women making clothing and such.
Right.
If you look at the figures of how much money England was getting from the colonies, it was like a rock dropping. When that economic activity, boycotts combined with creating their own goods, one of the main purposes of a colony is to make profit for the homeland.
Right, and if you
stop doing that, it's not worth it. And some people say the American Revolution, the war part, was really Great Britain trying to get back control of something they'd already lost, which was the colony.
Yeah. Now, another key aspect of movements, as we said, is diversity, but another part of that is solidarity. And this is something that I think is really critical because throughout time, power holders have been able to undermine social movements by what's called divide and conquer. So they start to divide out various groups within that movement and even, start to get them fighting against each other. One ways they do this is through blaming a certain part of the population for the problem that people are experiencing, rather than blaming the actual system that's responsible for the problem.
And you actually see that sometimes when you have infiltrators. Government or corporations send infiltrators into a movement, and they start to point fingers within the movement. So you start to cause conflict among people in the movement, and different factions form, they get divided. I love about the title of this slide, diversity and solidarity. It seems so contradictory. But if you can create solidarity and diversity, you're creating a very strong bond. If you can bring diverse people together to work for a common goal,
right?
That's a very strong
That's
bond.
something the power structure always fears.
That's exactly. They hate when blacks and whites get together.
Right.
They get control by dividing blacks and whites.
Well, think about Fred Hampton, who was murdered in Chicago, and part of his power was that he was actually bringing together whites and blacks in a very powerful way. Another way that divide and conquer plays out, which people may not even be aware of, is through giving increased status or resources or, putting in place public policies that favor one group over another. So, if I think about the Affordable Care Act, and here was a law that was really maintaining our current system, but even giving more money.
Maintaining our current system, meaning keeping an insurance-based healthcare system.
Exactly, a market-based healthcare system, a for-profit system, but even giving more public dollars to the private corporations, and of course, pharmaceuticals. They've been out of control, but basically, during the health reform process, they did put things into the Affordable Care Act that benefited certain populations, and that was a very calculated move to divide the movement and to get some segments to be supporting the ACA. So allowing children to stay on their parents' policies until they were 26, giving greater access to women, or reducing some of the disparities in healthcare costs between men and women, expanding Medicaid. These are all things that how can you say, well, we don't want to, we're opposing this policy even though it helps women and children and those of low income. That makes it very hard and very unpopular
All that
oppose it.
All that could have been done without the billions of dollars of subsidies. You could expand Medicaid without the ACA.
Right, but the other point is that if we'd actually put in place a system that covered everybody,
I know.
then
Totally.
then women would be better off, children would be better off, people who rely, of low income would be better off, but we would all have been better off. But instead of putting in place a system that benefited all of us.
The ACA is also a good example of how they divided the movement by buying people off.
Right.
There were lots of single-payer organizations
Right.
that went to work for the ACA and got tens of millions of dollars
Right.
for their organizations to do so.
And it's also a good example of the third part on this slide, which is threats of the above being taken away. So Jim Messina, who was the chief of staff for President Obama, and then in 2012 he was his campaign manager, would meet with the leaders of nonprofit organizations, progressive organizations in Washington, D.C. every Tuesday, and he would sometimes bring funders to that meeting, and basically he would give them their marching orders. This is what you can say. This is what you can't say. You can't talk about single-payer health care. And he would threaten to take their funding away if they weren't compliant.
Yes, they have a lot of power to divide and conquer, and if we're aware of it,
right,
and we create that solidarity with diversity, we can be impenetrable to it. But most often we're not. So we have to be very aware of it.
Exactly.
Now, one of the most important concepts is grand strategy.
Right.
Grand strategy, I'm not talking about strategic goals in trying to stop the ACA, for example.
Right.
I'm not talking about tactics. I'm talking about the bigger, overarching grand strategy. And this analysis really allows you to analyze if what you're doing is effective or not.
Right.
And it's basically 3 points. You want to, on your movement side, you want to always be expanding alliances.
Right, growing your capacity.
Mass movements win, fringe movements lose. So you want to make sure that what you're doing in the grand strategy expands your alliances. You want to make sure that it creates internal cohesion,
right,
solidarity, people working together, diverse people creating solidarity. So increasing your cohesion,
right,
your tactics and strategies need to do as well. And then finally, you want to deepen the resolve of people in the movement.
Right.
So they feel more and more confident, more and more resolute,
more
less
empowered,
willing to compromise, more and more empowered, willing to go forward and really attempt new things to get what they need.
Right.
Then you reverse that on the other side. If you look at what the power holders, the people in power, how they're impacted by your tactics and your strategies,
right,
you want to shrink their alliances.
Right.
You want people to leave that side and say, I'm not really comfortable with what the status quo is doing. They seem to be a little thievery going on, or whatever the issue is.
Right.
Too much violence by the police or whatever. And second, you want to create division inside, decrease their cohesion.
Right.
And if you can set up those kind of situations where they're forced to make choices and cause divisions, that's a very good strategy. And finally, you want to weaken the resolve. They have to get less and less confident that what they're doing is the right thing, and people are going to more and more likely to leave the status quo side and join the people power side.
We really saw these play out during the campaign for net neutrality.
Yes,
when we were initially in 2014, when we occupied the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission.
Did that show that?
For 8 days to try to put a reclassification of the internet onto the agenda. It was not on the agenda. And what we found is that, our occupation there did strengthen the movement and inspired people. Lots of people came down to join us. We got a lot of support from the cars that were driving by honking.
And people did when they saw we were willing to sleep outside, people did other things to help support the net neutrality fight.
Right,
If they're willing to sleep outside, well, I'm willing to at least call
make a phone call.
Send
an email. Right. And then on the flip side, inside of the FCC, what it turned out was that...
And that's where it was most stark, the flip side.
Right.
Go ahead, sorry.
Was that many many of the employees in the FCC support net neutrality, and so a lot of them were coming out to thank us for being there, and it actually lowered the morale inside of the FCC. Time magazine reported that the 8th floor where the administrative offices were was in chaos. They had to have a meeting of all the employees to try to build up their morale, and that action was successful in putting reclassification of the internet onto the agenda. And then from there, we had our foot in the door, and large, coalition of organizations, diverse organizations, worked together throughout the next 9 months, and we won net neutrality.
So you apply the grand strategy tests to that tactic.
Right.
On the movement side, everything accomplished. On the power holder side, everything accomplished.
So how do we put this into play? If you think of the power holders as being kind of a part of a building, and they need certain pillars to hold them up, then a goal of growing your movement and shrinking theirs is to try to chip away at those pillars and pull those groups into the movement, which simultaneously pulls them away from being in the pillar and weakens that pillar.
So you're weakening the power holders,
right,
by fracturing the columns that hold their power in place.
Right.
And you're strengthening the movement by pulling more people to it and growing the movement. So you're accomplishing both objectives: weaken the power holders, strengthen the people-powered movement. And this list of different pillars of power,
right,
is not a complete list. And you'll probably find if you do a local campaign, it'll be a very different list.
right,
Just to kind of give you an idea of how you can analyze who the power holders are and who you want to try to influence. Once you start to identify the pillars that hold power in place, then you can create strategies and tactics that target different pillars.
That's right.
To try to fracture them and bring people from those different pillars to your side. Some are more easy than others. For example, youth and workers. Those are pretty obvious. Some are more complicated, like the media, like the military and the police, the security state. But the goal is to kind of find a way with all these different pillars, weaken them, strengthen us.
Right. And a critical point about the police and the military is that once they come to your side, you have a 60% greater chance of being successful. So I think of right before the Berlin Wall fell, and there were a lot of protests going on. And by the way, the protesters did not think they were going to be successful that soon. It was a surprise to them.
Even the night before, they didn't know they were going to win.
Right. But the police were ordered to, fire on the crowd, and they refused to do that. And when that happened, boom, it all came down.
Yeah, and do you know what? The police is a complicated one.
It is.
Because, they are there for a purpose. They're
right.
paid to do a certain job,
right.
and that's not to help us.
Right.
And so some people don't even talk to the police,
mm-hmm.
And some people are too talkative to the police.
Right.
I think it's important to figure out the right balance there. I think if you're arrested, speaking as a lawyer, if you're arrested, definitely talking to the police is a mistake.
They'll try to be very friendly, and they're really just trying to get information from you.
And they'll ask something that seems innocuous,
right.
but it actually is not innocuous.
Right.
And so you got to be even chit chat, friendly talk after you're arrested is a mistake.
Right.
When it deals with before the arrest and you're doing a protest and the police are there, how do you talk to them?
Right.
I think you got to be very thoughtful about that.
Right.
And you have to really not have everyone talk to the police.
Right.
You've got to focus it. You have to have someone who's a liaison for the group,
right.
who can talk to the police, and even that liaison should realize they can't make decisions for the group. And that's
right.
actually an opportunity often. I know when I've been a police liaison, there are times the police have suggested something, and I say, I can't decide it. I got to go back to the group and discuss it.
Right.
And that's true.
Right.
You really should do that.
Right.
And that gives you time to think through how to respond to whatever the police are up to. But
right.
I think designating someone with clear objectives of what their purpose is as the spokesperson, liaison with the police can be a very positive thing. And there are other times that when you're in a protest movement, like we were in Occupy,
right.
Where we would circle the encampment at Freedom Plaza at night just to check on things.
Make sure everybody was good. Yeah.
And sometimes we would see police out there,
right.
and we'd engage them in conversation.
Right.
And it wasn't conversation about the Occupy necessarily.
Right.
It might have been about some of the issues we cared about.
Right. Just about kind of what was going on.
Why are people out there? Well, because of healthcare, and then they tell us, oh, we have the same problem in healthcare.
Wealth inequality.
We can't. Our salary's been held at the same level because the healthcare price keeps going up. So that's a big problem for us too.
Right.
College. Oh, my kid has a college tuition problem. I can't imagine how expensive it is. He's going into debt. I'm really worried about it. Healthcare. My mother, she's too young for Medicare, and she needs health care now. It's so expensive. So they are living in the community.
Right.
And so, I remember when Occupy was done in Baltimore, the police union actually endorsed Occupy.
Yeah.
Which is bizarre, thinking of that police union.
Thinking about how violent
that police union is so bad in many ways. So, but the idea again is to recognize you want to pull people in those pillars of power over.
Right.
Even bringing one police to your side is a big step.
It starts to fracture.
And sometimes they do it to themselves. Like in the Occupy New York situation, where they had arrested a bunch of protesters, had them behind a yellow mesh curtain. They were just there, not doing anything bad, and a white-collar cop, a commander, went over and pepper sprayed them all in the face. Right. There were a bunch of video cameras from people's phones, about a half dozen or more, showing what happened, showing there was no cause for that.
Right.
And
the women were just stuck behind a barrier.
And what was really interesting was that there were a blue-collar cop who says, whoa, I can't believe he just did that.
Right.
So right away there was a divide between the white-collar and the blue-collar cops. And if we, if movements see that, they should find ways to keep cracking that divide, keep building that divide, make it bigger.
The next thing we wanted to talk about was creating win-win situations or dilemma situations. Right. And this is where the movement shows that it's upholding a value and shows that the power holders are violating that. And you can use that intentionally to kind of start to divide these various pillars. And one action that we were involved in was also in New York, just after the Occupy time, when there was a Vietnam Veterans Memorial Plaza that had a 10 o'clock curfew, 10 p.m. curfew, but they only enforced the curfew when people were actually using it for, free speech reasons. And so some veterans, we assisted, organized an action to be there on the anniversary of the Afghanistan war, to do a ceremony reading the names of both the soldiers that died and also civilians who died in Afghanistan, and banging a gong and putting flowers at the memorial. And it was a long, drawn-out ceremony that we knew was going to go past 10 p.m. And this put the police in a dilemma. Do you arrest the veterans who are honoring the fallen, or do you allow them to go past the curfew? And so it was a win-win for us.
Break the law, we win.
Right.
Arrest the veterans, they lose.
They lose because it looked so terrible.
It's a very bad move on their part.
As you recall, the blue-collar police officers did not want to arrest us, and it was actually the commander in the white shirt who had to go and physically arrest us and then hand us off to the blue-collar cops.
That's right. So a divide was created right there. But that kind of, if you can figure out those kind of protests that put the power holders in a dilemma,
right, that can be a real benefit.
And that's why creativity is so important.
And then another piece of this is that it's really important to first to put forward a vision of a better society that you're trying to create, and then reassure those people who are involved in those various pillars that there's a place for them in that better society and that they'll be better off, for it. Think of civil servants.
People in media
right.
won't be controlled by government or big corporate. They'll become a different kind of media.
Right.
Workers will be better. Youth won't have all the debt. So you can go through each one of these different pillars of power and figure out how their lives would be improved in the transformation we're trying to create.
That's right. But it's important to articulate that so they're aware.
One of the most important things that movements have to accomplish to build power is create national consensus. And that's the phase of the movement we're in right now, is building national consensus. It'll take a while. It's not a fast phase. Right. And you have to, people have to see first that there's a problem.
Right.
They have to first acknowledge there is a problem. And then they have to see that problem's not being fixed by the current system, and more of the same won't fix it.
Right.
And so you have a problem that's not being fixed, and then you have to be open to an alternative solution.
Right.
And we have to have the solutions.
Right.
And so we can tell people, here's an alternative way to approach this that will solve the problem.
Right.
And so that's we're not talking about consensus. We're talking about 80, 85, 90% consensus.
Right.
On those kinds of questions. And those are kind of interesting questions. And they're very useful in any political campaign you're involved in,
Right.
any issue campaign. I first ran across it when I was working on drug policy. That was my first area of work, was ending the drug war, ending the war on marijuana, legalizing marijuana, putting in place a public health approach to drug abuse.
And that was in the 1980s.
1980s. And one of the key breakthroughs was the mayor of Baltimore, Kurt Schmoke, who was a former prosecutor and who came out in favor of ending the drug war, in favor of decriminalization or legalization. And he really used these 3 points very well in the advocacy. I mean,
to build support
to
for
build
him.
build support for the cause and politically for him.
Right.
People thought when he took this issue on, he was finished politically, because this is a third rail issue.
Nobody wanted
People
to
all
touch
thought
it.
if you touch that third rail, your political career is over.
Right.
He was elected twice after he came out in favor of any of the drug war. And what he did was he would go to black churches, which is a real foundational power source for elections in Baltimore.
Right.
I'd say it's one of 3 major power sources. And black churches can be pretty conservative.
Right.
And so he would go in and he would ask the congregation, do we have a drug problem? Is it affecting our community negatively? He'd talk about that. And everyone, of course, would agree, yes, of course we have a drug problem.
Right.
And then he'd ask, do you see the current system working? Is the mass incarceration, is the police arrests, is the drug war fixing the problem?
Right.
And everyone in the congregation would agree, no, of course it's not.
Right.
And more of the same won't fix it.
Right.
And so you have them saying, there's a problem, it's not being fixed. And he says, and how about, are you open to looking at other ideas that might work? And then you could talk about countries around the world that are putting in place harm reduction public health strategies, or Holland, where you can go into a coffee shop and buy marijuana, Switzerland, where you can go to a
Heroin assisted
treatment center where you can get
Right.
legal heroin. And so he opened their minds up, but he got that consensus. There's a problem, can't be fixed, open to new ideas. You can apply that to almost every issue we work on.
Right.
That analysis is so powerful. Mobilization. So in addition to developing national consensus, you have to mobilize a percentage of the population to take action.
Right.
And that can mean a whole variety of different kinds of things. It doesn't have to be people doing civil resistance and risking arrest. It could be a march. It could be petitions. It could be...
It could be slowing down their work. Civil servants could just, not process papers as fast to try to, kind of block the government a little bit from doing what it's doing. Well, I think about the scientists who, when Trump came into
Right.
office,
That's a good example.
the Department of the Environment, they started downloading all of the information that was going to be wiped off of the websites and putting it in a secure place.
That's right. And the history of movement shows that the magic number is 3.5%. What we mean by that is no government of any type is able to withstand 3.5% of the public taking action on an issue where there's national consensus.
Right.
That combination, 3.5% national consensus, the movement wins. Movements have won at 1%. They won at lower numbers, but 3.5 is the always victory number.
Right.
That's such an interesting number because it's so low.
Right. And people, I think, are, when you think like, oh my God, I need to get everybody out into the streets, but you don't have to get everybody out in the streets. You need to get 3.5% of people.
And
active.
or less.
Right.
Or less. And so it's an achievable goal.
Right.
And I think understanding that and sharing that information with people helps them see that movements can have power.
Right.
People don't understand how movements win. Well,
Right.
that's how they win.
Right.
They get a small percentage of the population active, they develop national consensus, and they win.
And be strategic about how, what you're doing. So then a final important factor is the resilience of the movement. And so one thing is being able to respond to your opponent. And so being flexible in how you're able to respond. You can't set a timeline and say, we're going to do this and this and this and this. You have to be constantly assessing what's going on and responding to that. And there's a tool that we use. It's called the OODA loop. And that stands for
Spell it.
OODA. It's observe, orient, decide, act. And so you're observing what's going on, you're orienting yourself to it, deciding how to respond to it, and then taking action. And then you go right back up to observing again, orienting, and you keep going around.
And the circumstances are always changing.
Right.
And so it's good to keep it's important to be flexible. So you're constantly observing, You're being flexible and you're being innovative
Right.
in responding to what the circumstances are.
Right, and again, going back to the FCC example, it was a very broad movement that was working on that, that was sharing information about, there were people who were actually, meeting in the FCC who could share information about kind of what the situation was, and then people could use that to decide how to intervene and push that issue forward. Part of this is tactical innovation is really important, and this is one reason why having a very diverse movement is helpful, because when you have lots of different groups, different perspectives, different cultures involved in your movement, then it's more likely that new tactics are going to be invented that you may not have thought of.
One of the challenges of movements is fatigue.
Right.
Because movements are not overnight events.
Right.
They go through multiple stages, and they're a slow process,
right.
taking years, sometimes taking decades.
Well, how many years did it take for you to go from first fighting for medical marijuana to it actually being?
Yeah, I mean, I started in 1980 when I was in law school, and we've only started to win in 1996.
Right. That's pretty fast, actually.
Well, that's almost 20 years.
Right.
And we're still fighting for legal medical and legal adult use. So
right.
It's not resolved yet,
right.
but we're at least making progress. But fatigue is a challenge. And I think there are ways to avoid or undermine the potential fatigue.
Right.
One is, I think, because you're changing tactics all the time, you get a variety of things you're doing.
Well, I think you have to consciously change
yes.
your tactics. So sometimes you're going to be
that's very true.
Mobilizing people to be very concentrated on a particular target or in a particular geographic location, and other times you're going to have more of decentralized, dispersed kinds of actions that people can do, that anybody can do in their daily life.
And when you do have victories, even small victories, it's important to celebrate them. People
Absolutely.
need to see progress. It's much easier to build on successes than it is on failures. Well, they got to build on failures too.
Yes.
But it's important to build, when you have successes, celebrate them and build on them.
Right.
And throughout the process, you should be trying to have fun.
If you can.
If you can. We're not doing this as a chore. We're doing it because we believe in it, because it's something that's in our hearts.
It needs to be done.
It needs to be done. And it should be almost a festival. That's why holding a peace festival, if you're working on anti-war stuff, or holding a anti-capitalist festival that could mock capitalism, can be a fun event.
We've had dance parties sometimes.
Dance parties. We did a couple of times. I can think of dance parties when we were being threatened by eviction at the Occupy in the early days. We had a big dance party. That was a blast. In fact, remember we had a gigantic dance party. You and I are on the stage trying to watch.
So we could keep an eye on what the police were doing.
Because the police are in the outskirts.
Right.
And so we want to be able to see over the crowd what the police are doing. At a certain point, the police left.
Well, there were a bunch of buses that they pulled up, empty buses along the road, which is what they usually do when they're going to make mass arrests. And then after about half an hour or so, those buses pulled away. I guess they decided there were too many people there.
The dance party worked.
Exactly, right.
We also celebrated a victory at the FCC with the dance. Party at the FCC. Party at the FCC.
Yeah, that was when we that was in the fall when we saw that we were actually, it was looking like we were going to win.
Right, and the FCC security called Homeland Security as we were partying in their driveway, and Homeland Security looked at us. I don't know if they even talked to us. They just looked at us and they decided.
Yeah, they did. They went in and talked to the security guards, and then they left. But I think what was funny is when the Homeland Security showed up, people started chanting, "Homeland Security, come join the party."
Homeland Security, come join the party.
Yeah. Let's shift in now to talking about negotiating demands, because I think this is an area where it's important to understand what's going on. And first off, we have to start with that some things are negotiable and some things are not negotiable.
Right.
So if you're talking about wages, that might be negotiable, right?
Yeah.
You can,
$20 versus $18 an hour.
Right.
Okay, we can negotiate that.
Right. When you're talking about people's ability to live or have their human rights respected, these are not negotiable factors. And that's the quote that we use from Gandhi, who said that you can't compromise on fundamentals because it's all give and no take. So if it's something fundamental, you do have to set that line that you're not going to
If
compromise.
if you're negotiating on a fundamental, you're essentially negotiating your defeat. You're giving up and giving them
something that's fundamental.
people in the power what they want.
Right.
And so one of the keys about negotiation is when you negotiate.
Yes.
It's very important that when you negotiate, you're in a position of power.
Right.
You have to build power first before you negotiate. I remember when we first did Occupy, we were debated for a month before we started. What are we going to demand?
Right.
It
People
took
said
us,
it's so important to have a demand.
So important to have a demand. And it was about a month of discussions about that we decided, we're not in a position to make a demand. We have no power.
Exactly. And that's what the negotiation is, purely a power dynamic.
It is.
For people to believe that you can appeal to the moral or good sense of your oppressor and convince them on those grounds that they should give in, that just rarely happens. That's called conversion, and it's extremely rare. What's much more
they don't
common,
change out of the good of their heart.
No, they don't.
They change because
they don't have a choice.
Politics makes it happen.
Exactly. And some things to be aware of is that power holders may try to negotiate before you've built power, and they know that they have the advantage in that situation and that you wouldn't be able to enforce what they negotiate. So they might say, oh, of course we're going to give everybody health care, but then when they don't give everybody health care, you don't have any power.
It was also like in the FCC net neutrality fight. We were building power, a record number of public comments, protests all over the country. Corporations are joining our side. We were really building power.
Right.
And the FCC suggested a hybrid.
That's right. Approach.
A partial victory for us.
Right.
But also not a victory for us.
Right. It still left loopholes in place.
Big loopholes. And so there were some people in our coalition that was ready to say, let's make the best hybrid we can.
Right.
We took the position that
and
was,
others.
And others, that was negotiating away a fundamental.
Right.
If we don't put it in Title II, where it's
it won't be protected.
It won't be protected.
Right.
And so we couldn't negotiate. So we decided to escalate.
Exactly.
And that's when we blocked the chairman of the FCC's driveway in Georgetown.
Right. Among other actions.
Yeah. And I think then after we did that,
things started to move.
Things turned in our favor to a complete victory. Now we're still fighting that fight now with the new Trump FCC, but it was a victory at the time, and it's not over yet with this one.
Right.
I think we're going to win in the end, but it's still a battle.
That's right. So negotiating when you're at too weak to actually enforce the outcome, you need to avoid that. And then another time that power holders will try to negotiate is when they see that they're starting to lose power and they want to hang on to it. And so again, they'll try to start negotiating with you. But it's really important to know that what you're able to negotiate depends on the level of power that you have built and that balance of power between you and the power holders. So there are kind of three phases to that, or mechanisms of change. And so one is the simplest one, that you don't have to build a lot of power to get this one. It's called accommodation. And it may be that what you're asking for is not something that's really that difficult for the power holder to grant. It's not going to hurt them that much, or affect their bottom line or their rich buddies' bottom lines, and so they may just go ahead and accommodate you because they want you to stop annoying them. Right?
So they'll accommodate you, and you get your victory.
Right.
That's more of a reform type victory
exactly.
than a transformational victory.
Right. The second level would be nonviolent coercion. And so this is when you've started to withdraw power from the power holders. You started to impact those pillars that are holding up their power. And so they see that if they want to actually maintain their power, they're going to have to give you something. And so they might, negotiate something that they're willing to trade off with you.
And the real one that you really want to try to achieve is a disintegration.
Right.
Where the power structure can't hold itself in place any longer, and you've really weakened the pillars of power so much and built your movement and its political power so much that you're going to get what you want. This is the moment where something that looked impossible when you started becomes inevitable.
Right.
And that is always the goal.
Right.
We take on issues often that look impossible, but you build the movement, you build the power, you keep building, you pull people from the power structure to your side. We saw that in the TPP,
right,
in a big way. When we first started that, people said, nobody knows what it is. But then they look at, wow, 600 corporations are negotiating this with the United States.
This might not be so good.
This is not going to be possible to stop. 600 corporations are against us. You can't defeat that.
Right.
And so, we started to educate. We started to get people organized with a lot of other trade activists who were already following trade for years since the globalization days.
Right.
They started to keep on building the movement, create a movement of movements because trade affected everything.
Right.
Affected the environment, affected food and water,
Internet
affected
freedom.
workers, affected healthcare,
Right.
everything. It was a classic movement of movement opportunity. And we did all sorts of spectacle protests where we got a lot of attention by doing protests and really showed that the movement was willing to take risks, was creative, and hard to predict.
Right.
And all of that added up to a situation where it became politically impossible to support the TPP.
Right.
Even Hillary Clinton, who had been Secretary of State when the TPP was being negotiated
And supported it.
came out against it.
Right.
Even Senator Portman from Ohio, who had been a U.S. trade representative
Right.
for the Bush administration, came out against it.
Right.
Donald Trump came out against it.
Right.
And in the end, President Obama, who had hoped to pass it during the lame duck between his presidency and the Trump presidency, that time period, what they call the lame duck period,
He saw it was not possible.
there was just not enough support.
And so,
The impossible became inevitable and total disintegration
Right.
on the side of the power holders when it came to the TPP.
Right. In fact, we had been organizing an action camp to start on the
That's
first
right.
day of the lame duck session of Congress
That's
when
right.
we thought they were going to try to push it through. And we had started organizing that back in April, and this was November. And on the Friday, the night before that action camp started, the White House announced that they were not going to seek ratification of that agreement.
And so we had to replan the whole action camp, which turned out great.
Right.
We did some great stuff,
Right.
but it was a great victory as well.
I think it was.
The classic debate, the ongoing debate, is violence versus nonviolence. And how do they work together? Do they counterproduct each other? Are they synergistic? What do we do about the violence versus nonviolent debate? First off, I think we have to understand that the definitions of violence and nonviolence are very unclear.
Right.
The one example is of the people who cut a fence to go onto a military base and take a hammer and hammer on military weapons,
Like missiles and things.
missiles and things. Is that violent? Some people would say yes, that's violent. That's property damage, and that's violent. And obviously prosecutors treat that as violence. They treat
Right.
it pretty aggressively.
Others would say that the weapon itself is violent, and what they're doing is trying to stop a greater violence.
Well, that's what we would say.
Right.
But the question is how does that play in the public in many respects?
Right.
And then the question of nonviolence has a lot of variables too. There's a pacifist approach, which
Right.
is a real
Dogmatic kind of approach. Yeah.
almost religious nonviolence, and then there's the strategic nonviolence. That allows for people to defend themselves.
Right.
If you're being attacked, can you fight back?
Right.
That's a question of violence versus nonviolence. Some people say that's violence. Some people say that's just self-defense.
Right.
And so there's a lot of challenges in the definition.
Right.
And so I think that's the first thing. It's not a very easy conversation to have because the words don't mean the same thing to everybody.
Right. And the other piece is that, when it comes down to it, spending a lot of time on what's violence, what's nonviolence, may be kind of a moot point because what you're really trying to do is go back to your grand strategy. Does the tactic that you're using build your capacity, strengthen your resolve, and expand the movement? If it's not doing those things, it's counterproductive. And so the research shows, I think as we said earlier, that if you are nonviolent in your movement, that you're twice as likely to succeed and that you have a more sustainable success than a violent movement does.
It's complicated also because there's often violent activists when there's a nonviolent movement.
Mm-hmm.
And so some people will credit the violence as why the nonviolence succeeded.
Right.
The evidence doesn't support that,
Right.
but still some people believe that.
Right.
And so that's something people need to look at much more closely, that think that the violent actually won it. Often the research actually shows the violence actually slowed the victory.
Right.
And got in the way of it. And because any little bit of violence in a movement can totally change the dynamic. Once the public sees violence,
Mm-hmm.
that then gives the police greater power.
Right.
Then some people in the public say, "Oh my God, I can't believe the protesters are so violent. They broke those windows. They burned that car."
Well, sympathy goes away from the protesters.
Exactly.
And
If
towards the
those, like
police.
we talked about those women in Occupy,
Right.
who were pepper sprayed, they were not being violent.
Right.
Now, if they were throwing batteries at the police,
Right.
or throwing sticks or stones,
Right.
then I think that blue collar cop would not say, "Oh
He
my
would have
God, I
said
can't
these women
believe."
are out of
They would
control.
say, "Thank goodness he did that,"
Right.
and you unify the police against you and the public against you, and so the violence issue is a very important one in that it really can undermine the grand strategy of the movement of building
Right.
them, because you can actually shrink the movement
Right.
when you go toward that approach. So I think it's very important to look at it from that perspective. Put away the violence, non-violence, because they're hard words to define, and instead talk about what are our goals. Is this consistent with the grand strategy? Will this grow the movement, or will this shrink the movement? Will
Right.
this create solidarity on our side, or create division? Will it divide or unite the opposition?
Right.
Though that kind of analysis
Right.
will get you to the right conclusion.
Right.
And every circumstance is different. We're not pacifists.
Right.
Our goal is to win,
Right.
and so we try to analyze things from the perspective of what works.
And I think also looking at the balance of power between
That's very important.
two sides, because or kind of capacity. Because if you look at, say, you look at the Palestinians and the Israelis, the Palestinians do sometimes use things like rocks, to throw towards the Israelis. But you're talking about, Palestinians in their regular everyday clothes who have no weapons, coming up against the Israeli Defense Force, which is funded by the USA and has,
The best weapons,
and the best training. They've got,
and are very
protective
aggressive.
gear, and
Many don't see Palestinians as humans. They
Right.
don't mind killing them.
right.
And I say that because that's what videotapes show.
Right, right. So it'd be hard pressed to call Palestinians violent when there's such an asymmetry.
They're
of-
defending
of
themselves. They're
equip-
defending themselves against ultra violence.
Exactly. Right.
But throwing a stone in that situation, now throwing a stone in another situation, could be violence.
Right.
But in that situation, the asymmetry, it's very hard to say that the Palestinians are being violent.
Right. So let's look at some of what Gene Sharp said about violence versus nonviolence. He was with the Albert Einstein Institution and wrote a number of books. One of them was From Dictatorship to Democracy. And he characterizes nonviolent struggle as being much more complex than violent struggle. It's using psychological tools, social, economic, and political tools to try to pull support away from the power holders. It's something that many people in the population can participate in, institutions of the society can participate in, like work slowdowns, various things that people can do to support the movement. And
aggressive, strategic nonviolence is more complicated, as Schwab says, but it's more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
It requires activists to really think about their targets, their opportunities, their approaches, and be creative,
Mm-hmm.
and not repeat the same thing over and over again, and really try to figure out what will be effective.
Right.
It's not like just shooting a gun.
Right.
It's much more complicated.
Much more nuanced.
It's much more nuanced and more difficult, and takes more patience and takes more time.
Right. And then lastly, let's look at kind of what we call David and Goliath. And this is basically the story of David and Goliath. Goliath was a very large person. David was much smaller. And, David set out to take on Goliath, putting on armor and going into battle with him, and then recognized that, well, he wasn't really a soldier. He didn't really know how to wear that equipment. It was keeping him from being able to move, and that he was just playing right into Goliath's strength. And so instead, David chose an unconventional way to defeat Goliath. And so what the research shows is that when you have this mismatch of power, about a third of the time, the underdog may win. But if that underdog group, the Davids, actually take on unconventional methods that build on their strengths and target the weaknesses of their opponents, that you can actually become more successful. You'll more than double your rate of success to 63%. So it's basically, if your opponent has a strong area, don't play on their turf. You need to find where their weakness is and play in ways that they may not anticipate, that they may not be prepared for in order to win.
This is another example of how movements have to be creative.
Mm-hmm.
They have to be unpredictable. where diversity is important because more people with different backgrounds create more creative ideas. And in order to, because we're going against powerful opposition.
Yes, we are.
We're going against corporations and governments that have unlimited amounts of money.
Right.
They have unlimited amounts of military and other violent equipment.
Right.
They have the power to lock people up.
Right.
They have immense powers, and they control a manipulated voting system, electoral system that they can be sure that the two candidates will both be Wall Street candidates.
Right.
And no matter who wins, the Wall Street
wins, right.
And so we have some very difficult terrain there. And so it's very important for activists to find unconventional strategies and pick different terrain and surprise the power structure with tactics they don't expect.
Well, again, going back to the FCC and our occupation of the FCC, it's kind of an out-of-the-way federal agency, doesn't see a lot of protests, and so having activists, camping outside their door for more than a week, having it grow, having the spotlight put on them when they're not used to that, and the fact that we were on the side of most of the employees also helped. But that was something that they didn't know how to deal with.
I was thinking of when you said that about what this kind of David Goliath unconventional tactics scenario is the flotilla of kayaktivists in the Seattle Bay when they were trying to do offshore drilling in the Arctic.
Right.
They took the unusual step of trying to stop drilling rigs and ships that were going to the Arctic with kayaks.
Right, blockading.
And signs.
Right.
With a flotilla.
Right.
I mean, whoever heard of a flotilla in a, this kind of a
taking on this giant ship.
Giant ship.
Yeah.
And in the end, they didn't stop the ships. They did amazing things with they were drumming off bridges and all sorts of.
They did stop one ship, the ship in Portland, for a few days.
They slowed them down, but weren't they rose awareness of the issue.
Right.
And they were already on the side of a broad consensus.
Right.
People don't want Arctic drilling.
Right.
And then they showed a strong, mobilized group of people willing to take risks.
Real resolve, yeah.
And be very creative.
Right.
And be out there facing off with a giant, the real David and Goliath, the kayak versus a big ship.
Right.
And the images of that just created a situation where while the ships got through, they went up there with one ship, did one test, and canceled the idea.
Right.
They knew they would have been fought every step of the way.
Yeah.
That's what the movement had shown. We're willing to do anything to stop you.
Right.
And that kind of resolve really had the impact.
And so Sharp goes on to say that when you're mounting a political defiance movement and there's a group that engages in violent action, that you're actually now shifting from a terrain where you have more tactics and ability to undermine the support for the power holders into an area where they have the resources and the strength. Because if you justify aggression upon yourself, they have a lot of tools to use that. So he says that that's to be avoided, but sometimes you can't avoid it because of circumstances. There may be people, people are experiencing real violence, economic violence, and other things.
And legitimate anger.
Right. And so there may be times when some violence rises up. And he says if it's possible to separate that from the political defiance movement by either, space or time, do it in a different place, a different time, a different segment of the group.
Different people involved.
Right. Then that will lessen potentially the impact on undermining your political defiance movement.
So with that,
I think that's everything we wanted to cover today.
the next class will be focused on the stages of successful social movements.
Right.
It's a multi-stage process, and when you go through the process and understand it, it makes it much easier for your movement to continue onward.
Right.
To continue
You
to
can
grow.
see where you are.
See where you are. You know what your job is in that phase of the movement,
Right.
and what roles people can play in that phase of the movement. So we're going to go through the stages of successful social movements in the next class. Really appreciate you joining us. Look forward to discussions in the discussion groups.
Thanks.